and welcome to another episode of Widdecombe Webb and Woberts. I'm Emma Webb and I'm joined by the former Shadow Home Secretary and Brexit Party MEP Anne Widdecombe and comedian Abi Roberts.
Hello.
I would like to say that this week, in the last couple of weeks, the only show in town has been Cop26, the Eco-Circus, as I'm referring to it now. But actually, there have been an awful lot of other very troubling things, and that's why Abi is dressed in black in mourning for
my country.
Particularly on the free speech front, a number of strange, woke and free speech issues in various different institutions, which we will get onto. But first, shall we start with the Eco-Circus and what we have seen in the last couple of days with the hypocrisy, I think, is probably the best way to
a lorry load of hypocrisy. Clouds and clouds of emissions coming behind those planes as they all came in. They've then got umpteen cars at their service. I don't believe for one moment that they're all electric.
85 cars in Biden's cavalcade.
It is completely hypocritical, but it's hypocritical without the sort of end result that might justify it. Because so long as China is not going to be actively involved, we might as well forget it. We contribute a little 1% of emissions. We might as well forget it unless you can get the big players committed.
And this is a point that Peter Hitchens has made as well, which is that you're basically, because it's a drop in the ocean, we're sacrificing ourselves for absolutely no effect if countries like India and China.
But even if we were producing more, I think it's the principle of the fact that we've got these people acting like they're Versailles. We're back in Versailles, swanning around. If they'd all swum to Glasgow from where they were, and they moved out of their palatial homes into little eco kind of yurts. And they ate mud and rode bicycles, I'd say, do you know what, great guys, and all dressed in Hessian, or just sort of like
John the Baptist style.
Yeah, John the Baptist. If you're gonna go full eco, if you're gonna tell everyone else that the planet's burning, you better change your own ways before you start dictating to other people. Otherwise, everyone's going to ignore it.
And did you see the Daily Mail? Though I think they've now rewritten the article, but the original headline that they ran with pointed out that Carrie had eco credentials because she was very much like Anne's lovely red blazer, was wearing a Zara blazer that apparently she'd worn twice, and that was evidence of her eco credentials. And lots of people pointing out that they've been wearing the same the same fleece for the last 25 years.
But that smells nice. Luxury communism. That's what it is, isn't it? I mean, it's literally like, look at us. That's nothing to do with
But it's do as I say, not as I do. I mean, that is the crux. It's a bit like Meghan Markle, actually. Yeah. That is the crux of it.
Exactly. And also, as you say, Anne, why are they going for, only down the warming? I tell you what, we're going to be in serious trouble if everyone's gone down the warming route, and in fact, it turns out that we might be going into a cooling phase. Because guess what? How are we going to heat our homes?
There was a professor also who, on GB News was talking about how the fossil fuel companies have essentially not been invited to the party. So they're actually having this conference about the fossil fuel industry but not inviting them along. And he was saying that one of the ways that you could approach the problem is by decarbonising fuel. Apparently it's possible to decarbonise fossil fuels. And it made it sound as if what actually is going on is just a sort of pantomime. It's just a diplomatic pantomime.
Why can't we just build nuclear and have
on the
done
table?
with it?
Exactly.
Just have done with it.
Yeah.
And if we build nuclear, it's everlasting. It's clean.
Yes.
It's safe.
It's safe now. Yes, exactly.
Let's have it and be done with all these wind turbines, which depend on the wind, believe it or not.
Exactly.
The clue is in the name. It depends on the wind.
Exactly. So it's not a windy day. Bad luck, everyone. You're not getting any electricity.
Solar depends on the
sun. And if solar activity is changing, which this is the other thing as well. Why does nobody mention solar activity? What the sun's doing? It's absurd to be talking about global warming and leaving out the sun.
The one person I heard talk about that the other day was actually Lembit Opik.
Oh, he's brilliant.
Who normally talks nonsense, but who was talking absolutely good sense about what the sun was doing. Yeah. But we never hear that. We're
Yes.
being encouraged to believe it's all about what we're doing.
Exactly.
And if I light a coal fire, that, you know, is going to bring about the end of the world. But what the sun's doing doesn't matter at all.
Yes, exactly. It's dogma, it's ideology. I mean, I know there's a great guy, I think he's American, called Rex Fleming. I don't know if you've heard of him. He used to be in NASA in the 70s. So he was all up for this. He was like totally like, yeah, man, it's all to do with human beings, like burning too many. And then he suddenly had an epiphany, woke up and started questioning the narrative, and was then shot out of all the climatology institutions, and to this day,
do you think
the problem? I tell you what the problem is. I tell you, Emma, what the problem is. It is there's so much money invested in the warming.
Yes,
the research. I mean, you know, half the universities would suddenly find, you know, their funding disappearing.
Precisely.
It's insane.
And you know what's interesting? You know James Dellingpol's book Watermelons, which I highly recommend, which is that the green movement is green on the outside and red on the inside.
Yeah.
And I remember there was something that really struck me when I read it, which is that if an ideology from the left is making money, then that's when you really have to ask what its credentials are.
Is the reason why we see, like, I personally am probably one of the only people in the country who is lukewarm on climate change. I don't really have an opinion in one way or the other. But if it is the case that global warming is a problem, are we actually holding ourselves back? Because like you mentioned, nuclear, there are other benefits to nuclear as well, like making ourselves independent from other countries that might not have our best interests at heart. Exactly.
Russia, France,
So my question is, and we can talk about Justin Welby, I'm sure we've got lots of opinions on him and his comments on this, but is the sort of like the ideological puritanism around climate change and how exclusive this sort of eco-elite has become, is it actually excluding options that could actually be useful if they had a place in the debate? Things like nuclear, but also this professor who was talking about decarbonising fossil fuel, hydrogen.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, although I wouldn't want to put a lit match next to hydrogen because, well, that really would be a bit disastrous.
Yeah.
Well, we don't really even have a proper public discussion about the costs of net zero, and lots of people have been talking this week about having a referendum on net
but
zero.
There's no such thing as net zero. This is the crazy thing. Climate, you know something? It's language is being bastardised so that climate change is actually a phrase that people think makes sense, but the climate's been changing for billions of years. I mean, it's just crazy.
And it changes forwards and backwards.
And exactly, forwards and backwards, and you have peaks and troughs. It's the same with this net carbon. It doesn't. There's no such thing as net carbon. I mean, everything's made of carbon. This is made of carbon. We're all made of carbon. I mean, it's kind of crazy. It's not science. It's dogma, and that's why we are where we are with many things, not just the climate.
So I mentioned Justin Welby because I wanted to get your thoughts on his comments, because we talked about obviously the Church of England on the last episode. He made some comments to Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC political editor, and then immediately had to apologise for them. And she tweeted saying that he had told her that leaders will be, quote, cursed if they don't reach agreement in the next fortnight, and suggests a failure to act would be possibly, wait for it, more grave than leaders who ignored warnings about the Nazis in the 30s. So obviously he's apologised for this very quickly, even before he'd really been criticised very much for it. He said, "I unequivocally apologise for the words I used when trying to emphasise the gravity of the situation facing us at Cop26. It's never right to make comparisons with the atrocities brought by the Nazis, and I'm sorry for any offence caused to Jews by these words." I mean, the man can't do anything right, can he?
Keep digging, Justin. You're nearly in Australia.
Should he?
What do you think?
Should people like Welby and Prince Charles even be sticking their nose into this?
I mean, Prince Charles is somewhat different, because whatever you can say about Charles, the one thing you can't say about him is that he doesn't practice what he preaches. I mean, he's got all these initiatives going on, and I may think he's balmy to talk to plants, but nevertheless.
Don't talk about Camilla like that.
Don't be rude. I'm a Camilla fan, just in case anybody interprets that as me being complicit with it. My being complicit with it, let's be grammatical. So, what was I talking about? Yes, Prince Charles, I think, is one thing, but Justin Welby, what is the mission of the church on earth? I always thought it was to save souls. Mm-hmm. But the Church of England appears to have thought it's to make political pronouncements. And to make them almost for pastime.
But because this has become, we were saying that it's become sort of purist and exclusive, because that's the case, does that mean that in the case of the Church, but also in the case of Prince Charles, the Queen, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, should they be more careful about the way that they engage with issues surrounding the climate, given that in the past, obviously Charles has been an eco guy for a very long time, and I agree with that. I think it's a really good thing to be a responsible custodian of the planet, but now it's become more of a political issue. Should they be more careful about the sorts of things that they say?
I mean, first of all, to be fair, the monarch said nothing on the record. It was something that was picked up and then blown up. And I don't think you can complain about that at all. I mean, I think this monarch has been the model of discretion throughout. And I'm not worried about that. And what did she say at the end of the day? She said she gets irritated by people who talk and don't do. Frankly, so do I.
Yes.
So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Charles has always said, but I think in view of the state of Her Majesty's health and her age, he might now start putting what he's saying into practice. He's always said there's an enormous difference between being the Prince of Wales and being the monarch. And he knows that when he is the monarch, he's not going to be able to make these sorts of comments. I think he should start practicing now.
Yeah, I mean, there's just one slight problem, which is that he's been so vocal about this that it's going to be quite difficult for him, I think, to row back on quite a lot of it. And I would say with Justin Welby, I mean, maybe this is actually a good example of how if you have an absence of God in society, then you create other faiths, false prophets, and that's
other heresies.
And other heresies.
Yeah. Well, the idea that they would be cursed if they failed.
Cursed if you, how dare you, not... Well, then tell you what, Justin, give up all your worldly goods, go and live in an igloo, and...
Actually,
and
move out of Lambeth Palace into the wigwam.
To be
fair to Justin Welby, he gave up a very wealthy career at a bank. So
done.
No. To be fair to him, he did that in order to do something that he thought was more important. I do think it's crucial to be fair to people, because they're not fair to people, and therefore, it's
perhaps
a
he would have been better at running a bank.
They should be doing.
Yes, Emma's maybe he'd be better at running a bank. Being in the Church of England. I mean, the thing is, I think it's really unfair to terrify. Adults are terrified enough by this ridiculous stuff, but children, think about what Justin Welby, what those words about, you'll be cursed, it'll be like the Nazis.
They're also setting themselves up for failure. The idea that if we don't succeed, then humanity will be doomed puts an awful lot of weight on the British shoulders, I think, in this.
Yes. Oh, a little 1%, don't forget.
Exactly, and when realistically we can't do anything when we can't force the hand of China and India.
Although I sometimes think, sorry, just to be a slight, put a dampener on it, that the 1% argument is getting wearing a little bit thin now.
Why?
Because if we are pursuing if we're not looking at Plan B, which is the cooling bit, then it doesn't matter what we're producing. Because it's the principle of the thing.
But the point is, they are arguing on the basis of warming, and they're arguing on the basis of warming.
Yeah.
And therefore you are entitled to say to them, okay, supposing you're right, we're only doing 1%. What on earth use is all of this?
So I want to get your thoughts on something else. I'm interrupting you. I'm moving because we could talk about this all day.
Could.
So I'm moving you on to something that's going to make you even more angry.
And crossed off climate.
Yeah, I've just eliminated
Eco-Circus done. So this will make you even more angry, and that is the online safety bill proposals coming from the Law Commission, that people could be potentially sentenced to 2 years in prison if they post something online that is considered to be likely to cause psychological harm to another adult, I might add, not children. And it talks about the harmful effect. It's that radical subjectivism that we've talked a lot about in the past. And it also includes new laws surrounding misinformation, so intentionally posting false information. The example that has been used is anti-vaxxers. So what are your thoughts on that?
We're living in Maoist China. Sorry, I'm going to call us. I'm sick of this, namby-pambying around this issue. We do not have a Conservative government. We are not even slowly, we are hurtling down a slippery slope, so slippery that it's owned by Mr. Slippery from Slippy Town. In all seriousness, we cannot keep sort of being polite about the government that we've got at the moment. let alone the global elite that are running
the thing that I
the
find
world.
so, and we talked about this before we were filming, that I find so troubling about not just this but other suggestions as well, suggestions coming from the Law Commission, the Hate Crime Act in Scotland that is now legislation, is this idea that this should even be a subject for legislation. This is something that we should even be discussing. The idea of likely psychological harm.
Well, hang on. If you're actually looking at online safety, then you do have to consider things like encouragement to suicide. You do have to consider how that impacts on teenagers. You do have to consider those things. I'm not saying there is no case at all. But what we absolutely know from the experience of the last couple of decades is these things grow like topsy. Yeah. And what may start off very reasonable and very restrained becomes ridiculous. And the thing about hate crime is it isn't necessary objectively to have committed an offence. It is if somebody else perceives that you have committed an offence.
Yes.
Since when can some one person's perception define a legal offence?
And also, what about the psychological harm that the government and its policies have wreaked on the public, on the great British public? What about that?
And no consideration for the harm caused to society by the chilling effect on free speech that stops people being able to discuss things in the first place.
Yes, being fearful, constantly chipping away. And I think, it's time we really, really started taking this seriously and there was action. Because otherwise, intellectuals is all very well, intellectuals like Douglas Murray talking about it and saying, oh my goodness, Western civilization. But actually, it's happening now. So, we have to, people like myself are going to have to maybe get on the ramparts.
I think that suggestion that of even being reported as it was in the Times and other papers as well, that of 2 years in prison for something that you post online has surely got to be enough to make people think, well, I'll just stay on the safe side and I won't express any opinions at all.
I'd happily do 2 years.
Except those that are orthodox, of course, the modern orthodoxy. So you can express those opinions.
Yeah.
Well, it's only certain opinions that can't be expressed.
These proposals are also supposed to deal with what they call Twitter pylons. The question there would be, Twitter pylons of what variety? How would that, as you say, would that only be if it's against the orthodoxy? Is it going to include Twitter pylons against people? Twitter pylons against people who are regarded as... So if someone posts something, say, I'm thinking like a Catholic priest posts something that is an orthodox Christian opinion that is regarded as having caused or likely to cause psychological harm against women who may have had an abortion.
Yes.
There's an example. And if that priest is then subject to a Twitter pylon, which way does it go? If they are regarded as having caused psychological harm, or or will it be the people who have orchestrated the pylon that will end up in trouble for that? I mean, it just seems like this is not something that you should even be trying to legislate for.
The lawyers will have a field day. The lawyers will have a field day in both directions.
Surely it's unmanageable in that sense.
Now, I think you should pick out certain things. I mean, encouragement of suicide is something that you can pick out. And I think there are one or two other things that you can pick out. Actual direct threats of physical harm, I think you can pick out. But the idea of this sort of great generality of anything likely to cause psychological harm, well, all you've got to do is say, I am psychologically damaged, and you've got an offence, which is ludicrous.
Shall we talk about the Old Vic's decision to cancel Terry Gilliam? We're on the subject of free speech still, over his views on trans, apparently. So Terry Gilliam, for anyone who doesn't know, was formerly in Monty Python. So he's a comedian. He's apparently this decision has been made because his views had concerned staff. He was about to co-direct a musical called Into the Woods at the Old Vic.
Sometime, yeah.
And so some of his views that he'd expressed, he'd supported Dave Chappelle, the comedian who they were trying to get his show taken down from Netflix because he'd made some trans jokes. And he described Dave Chappelle as being socially aware, dangerously provocative and gut-wrenchingly funny. He'd made some comments about the Me Too movement being a witch hunt, said that he hated Harvey Weinstein, but also said that decent people were getting hammered by the movement. And so they've now made this decision essentially to not run the show as planned.
Well, I mean, it is insane. It is yet another demonstration of the way that we've lost sight of what free speech is, actually. This country no longer understands what free speech is. Speech is only free if you happen to agree with state orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And if you don't agree with the orthodoxy of opinion, then, you mustn't speak. And frankly, it's the modern Inquisition. That's what we've got. We've got a modern Inquisition. It is every bit as bad, except that it doesn't use physical torture, but in all other ways it is as bad as, and on the same principles as, the Spanish Inquisition. It really is.
Which Monty Python, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. And it's so true that Terry Gilliam should how the irony that he should be, suffering from precisely the thing he made jokes about, with Monty Python. But I think one of the things, I found it hilarious. He said I think this was a few years ago, he said he identifies as a black lesbian. And of course everyone laughed raucously because he's a funny man. That's what he does. He makes jokes. And the fact that the Old Vic, the fact that they have actually listened to these little sort of
And how many of them were there, I wonder?
Oh, probably like a handful. Probably sort of coming in and saying, how dare you have this white
And the people
man
who go to the Old Vic, what about what they would want? Are they being consulted?
Yes,
in
exactly.
any of it?
Probably not. And I have to say, this is not the first time this has happened. It happened at the Soho Theatre. They pulled a show of a great comedian who had already had a successful show. So the same show, but somebody had spotted a line in it, which was, they thought, his show was pulled.
The whole show.
The whole show was pulled. Yep.
It's not dissimilar from the sort of thing that you see in publishing, where you get complaints from staff members, as like with Jordan Peterson's book, when staff members apparently cried because they didn't want to publish his book 12 Rules for Life.
They didn't want to do critical thinking. Oh no.
It's the same with J.K. Rowling also. Many of these, so many publishers, internal complaints from staff.
Why do these people
why don't they stand up to them? This is what I don't understand. Why don't they stand up to them? Why didn't the Old Vic say get a life?
Yes, exactly.
So another institution that's gone bad, or in a similar way, and this is really the icing on the cake. This story, the Tate Britain has an exhibition about William Hogarth, which is called I think it's called Hogarth and Europe. And Hogarth is known for these depictions of drunken lads brawling, and that's probably not a very intellectual way of describing it. 18th century debauchery and drunkenness.
Newcastle on a Saturday night. That's what he was doing,
So now this exhibition at the Tate has got a number of descriptions of Hogarth's work, which I'm just going to read them out to you because I think that, it's sad, but in a way it's amusing. And so for one of his paintings, a Midnight Modern Conversation, which is one of his early works, which shows men who are drunk on punch. This is the description. It says, while the picture is superficially moralising, we are clearly meant to find the men's woozy misbehaviour funny. However, we might also consider that the punch they drink and the tobacco they smoke are material links to a wider world of commerce, exploitation and slavery. It goes on to say that it is queasily celebrating such manly misdemeanours, what we might today call laddishness. And,
good grief.
And here's another one. So Hogarth's self-portrait of him sitting on a wooden chair. There's an artist called Sonia Barrett who apparently uses 18th century furniture in her whatever it is that she does.
Sounds thrilling.
And she's described this image as, in her commentary on it, that I presume in the gallery is alongside the image, says, the chair is made from timbers shipped from the colonies via routes which also shipped enslaved people. Could the chair also stand in for all those unnamed black and brown people enabling the society that supports his vigorous creativity? They also made points about Brexit. It goes on and on. They said that the exhibition itself couldn't offer an account of Hogarth that was external to the heritage of colonialism, because the exhibition is a Eurocentric project. And this is a direct quote from the curators. They said, as the authors of the framing narratives and the organisers of the sequences of works reflected here, we have to acknowledge these occluded perspectives and the possibility of, it's so difficult to read, it's such jargon, the possibility
Is it still going
for
about the work of
other,
art?
more radical,
They think of
decentering,
Hypocritical.
the possibility for other, more radical, decentering perspectives that would represent more fully the agencies of those subject to colonial violence. So take a breath. My God, I mean...
Is that still Sonia, what's her name, Barrett? With the wooden chair.
Those were the curators of the exhibition. I mean, it's incomprehensible
It's beyond
to a
parody,
normal.
actually. It's beyond
It is.
parody.
Yeah, you're right.
It's absolutely beyond parody.
So trying to read out the word salad, if a normal person were to go to visit. This, in a way, is actually, it's quite snobby of them. They're using language that excludes normal people from being able to go and read about the art, because anybody that hasn't had
but normal people will go and look at the pictures and enjoy them and make their own interpretation.
They would,
That's what
quite.
normal people do.
But they would.
They don't need
Somebody
somebody else to tell them
A
what to
whole
think.
essay.
No, not at all. But somebody who, I mean, you can see what they're trying to do with the language. It's almost like they're trying to exclude normal people from being able to understand anything to do with the art whatsoever. I mean, talking about decentering perspectives, it's a very specific academic jargon.
Sort of Bolshevik. Like, here's some art, but you can't enjoy it. Only we can enjoy it.
And we'll tell you what you should think
We'll tell you
about
what, We'll tell you what you should think about it. And you can live in poverty
and total insanity.
Totally mad.
Right, that's
Total
the funny
insanity.
break.
And also laddish.
That's
the comedy interval. And
that was the icing on the cake. We've come to an end, actually.
And I think we should have a laddish glass of wine.
We'll have something laddish.
Be raucous.
So, insanity. Thank you for joining us. Like, comment and subscribe if you feel that way inclined, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Abby, thank you, Anne.
I'm still in a state of amusement, utter amusement.
Try not to despair.